Hello friends, I am really excited today to be sharing with you a subject that I'm really fascinated about, which is the gigantic trees of the Pacific Northwest. And I have 3 other talks about them, and I've had quite a number of views on those talks, so check them out. But this is all stuff that I found since then. They're pretty amazing stuff. My source for all of this is Micah Ewers, who is one of the leading online experts on trees, and he's done a lot of research in newspapers and old lumber logs and has found things that nobody else has. And he also was interviewed by the Seattle Times about the Nuk Sac fir, which I will be talking about. The first trees I want to discuss, though, are one that I've not mentioned before, and I think part of the reason is there's just not a lot of information on it, which is the Sitka spruces. Usually find them over the Olympic Peninsula close to the ocean. They like to be near the ocean if possible. And they're a climax tree, so they will take over and be the dominant tree in that area. And there's still some big ones today. There's one in Vancouver Island that's 320 feet tall. And there was one that's 19 feet in diameter in the Olympic Peninsula, but it lost its top. But none of them compare to this one I'm going to tell you about, which was one that was almost 400 feet tall and was 20 feet in diameter. And I have a picture of it that I will show you now. Isn't that amazing? There's also the God's Valley spruce, which was 24 feet in diameter. And that's just incredible. The next trees I'm going to speak about are like that. There's not a lot of records for the Western Red Cedar. You don't find them that much. But one of the interesting things I saw in Micah's records was there were a lot of these. They are the climax forest quite often. The Western Red Cedars and the hemlocks will usually be the ones that completely take over a mature forest. This forest near Tillamook, the average size of these Western cedars were 12 to 20 feet in diameter, and many of them were over 350 feet tall. There's nothing that big today. The biggest was the Ocasta cedar, which was 400 feet tall, 23 feet at the base, and the first limb was 7 feet in diameter, which is about the size of your average old growth tree today in the old growth forest. 7 feet for the first limb. Can you imagine? There was a cedar that was near the Nuk Sac fir that I'm going to be speaking about up in Whatcom County that was 32 feet in diameter. That's like as big as a redwood. And one in Vancouver, BC that was 26 feet in diameter. So there were some really big ones out there. My favorite forest to go to is at Lake 22 on the Mount Loop Highway. And if you go in there, there's a climax Western Red Cedar Forest where all the trees are about 8 to 10 feet in diameter, and they're all cedars, and it's really spectacular. It looks like you're surrounded by Ents from the Lord of the Rings. The next tree I'm going to talk about is the Nuk Sac fir, which is very, very famous because it's quite often touted as being the one that has the greatest height, which is 465 feet tall, which is just mind-boggling in height. Now, I asked Micah about this, and he said that the leading experts on big trees that have written books about it were skeptical about this. And Micah, the problem with it is, we don't have any exact measurements of the tree before it was cut down. All we have really are the records of the lumber that was cut out of it. And so you can get a good idea. And Micah has done estimations on that. And he's figured out that it certainly could easily have been between 400 and 465 feet tall by the lumber that's in it. I will leave it up to you to decide if you think it's that tall, but it certainly is fabulous. But there's some other really big firs that I want to mention. There were the Lynn Creek fir up near Vancouver was 415 feet tall. This Nuk Sac fir was almost 13 feet in diameter. So it was not just tall, but it was fat. There was a Douglas fir that was felled near Tacoma back in the early days. And it was the tallest that I have heard of, that we have verifiable records of it. It was 417 feet tall. Now that's almost 40 feet taller than the tallest redwood today. One thing that, one other tree I want to mention was there was a Douglas fir that was blocking the Chicago, Milwaukee, and Puget Sound Railroad from being built, and they had to cut it down. Had to, like they hated cutting down big trees. This tree was 18 feet in diameter, which there are no Douglas firs that big today in width, and it was 400 feet tall, which would make this tree bigger than the Mineral Creek fir, which I talked about in another video. There was some eastern lumberjacks who went into a grove of Douglas firs, and this is something I want to emphasize to you. When they went into the grove, every tree in there was without limbs up to 250 feet. So there were no limbs below 250 feet. All of these trees would have been 350 feet tall, at least, a whole grove of trees. There are no trees that are 250 feet, 350 feet tall today that we know of. There might be some that are hidden. The problem was that, see, they would go in there and they looked for these trees that were like that. That's the perfect cutting tree, because you wouldn't have to cut off any limbs. They could just cut off that, and they'd cut off the top, and then have 250 feet of lumber to go from. And you hardly ever see these trees today that have this long, treeless expanse, which is so thrilling to see, because they cut them all. And the other problem with Douglas firs is that they liked the lowlands. They grow up on the mountains, but they really loved the lowlands. And some of the areas where they got the biggest were in the prime bottomland, where they had soil that was enriched by flooding and by bears eating salmon and pooping and enriching this. It was rich soil, so that's how they could get so big. Well, they just cut it all. And what we are left with are the dregs, pretty much. There are some very impressive trees that are around, but most all of them are just the ones that were left behind. Here in Seattle, we have a tree in the east side that was the tallest tree in King County. When I first moved here, it was 250 feet tall. It was 8 feet in diameter. It's lost its top. It's still very impressive looking, but the problem with it is that the reason why it was left was because most of the trunk is taken up with limbs. They start about 20 feet up, and so they didn't want that type of thing. You go into the old growth forests around Seattle, most of them have low limbs. You don't have any of these trees that have that just long, treeless expanse of wood that's just so amazing that, quite often at 250 feet, these trees were sometimes still 8 to 10 feet in diameter. I mean, it was insane how much lumber was in these trees. Whatcom County, which is where the Nuk Sac fir was and where that 32-foot fir was found, cedar was found, it was one of the best areas because it was right at the base of where Mount Baker was, and it got all that volcanic ash and then all of the rich stuff coming out of the mountains. And they said it was just insane. They said you walked in there and all of the trees were over 303 or 50 feet tall. All of them. They were all like this. And they all had this long area with no thing. Some of the trees were up to 21 feet in diameter. I just can't imagine a Douglas fir that big. I'm going to show you a picture now of a Douglas fir that was 19 feet in diameter. It's one of the few that we have pictures of. It's really big. And then I'm going to also show you a couple of pictures of a 17-foot thick Douglas fir that's pretty well known, called the West Home tree. So I've enjoyed sharing with you these incredible Douglas firs of the past. Man doesn't think about the future. It only thinks about money so much of the time. The only forest that we have a lot of times where some people donated some stuff and saved some stuff for the national park, or it was stuff that was left behind. I'm glad we have that, but I just love thinking about what these virgin forests must have been like. And if I could time travel, that would be one of the things I would most want to see, is to go back and see one of these forests of Douglas firs that were just massive. And it's not just that they are tall. These trees are very beautiful, and their bark is really beautiful. And the form of them when they get really old is just lovely, because the limbs up at the top get really thick. It's just wonderful. I've enjoyed sharing with you my passion about really big trees. Thank you.